Hello everybody and welcome to the YouTube Aztec channel. That's the Azure Technology channel. My name is Neil Millington and I'm a cloud solution architect working at Microsoft. Today's video is going to be talking around the SQL Server product, and in particular I want to talk about SQL Server backups being taken to Blob storage, and in particular this is contextually around the Blob storage offering. As you can see here, this course is basically, as all the others are, is pitched at the level 300 and above. Basically that means, as you can see here, it's the Microsoft classification for training for levels 1 through to 400. We're level 300, so level 300 assumes knowledge and understanding of the features that we're going to be talking about in this video. What that translates to is basically some tools and prerequisites. So the prerequisites, you need to have an understanding of SQL Server, in particular the backup command. You actually want to back up a database to Blob storage. In light of that, you're going to need to know how to use SQL Server Management Studio or Operations Studio, a way of using one of the graphical tools to run your SQL backup commands through, so you can follow through this video. You're also going to need to have an understanding of the Azure Blob offerings, and in particular the account types, 3 account types. There's a general purpose V2, general purpose V1, and a Blob storage account. So basically I'll just touch on those, but you need to have an understanding of what that means and how it's appropriate to your organization's tools. We're going to be using, obviously you need an Azure subscription to get access to the Azure services, and inside that subscription there's 2 services we're going to be using in particular. We're going to be using, as I mentioned, the Blob service, and also SQL Server. Now the SQL Server doesn't necessarily need to be an Azure IaaS or an Azure PaaS offering. This is also applicable to on-premise as well, but for my demonstration I'm going to be using an IaaS VM. So in particular the point here is it has to be SQL Server 2016 or 2017. So the ability to write backups to Blob storage was introduced in SQL Server 2012, but that was a page Blob backup, and in particular we're talking about Blob backups. That was introduced in SQL Server 2016 RTM. So that's clearly the version that you're going to need for this functionality. So very quickly, what are some of the benefits? Why would you want to use Azure Blob storage to take SQL Server backups? Ultimately, it's very flexible and reliable, and in theory, it's a limitless off-site storage. So traditionally, for companies where they had an off-site backup principle, it often went down to sending some sort of media off-site, frequently tape-based systems. So obviously, there's a cost, a reliability of the tapes, and then obviously times for tape recalls, tape mounting, cataloging, all that sort of procedures, and these can be significantly reduced by using Azure Blob storage. One of the other ones is as a result of that, there's then no overhead of hardware management. So for example, you're using Azure services. Basically you just plug into those Azure services and start to use them. There's no need to procure equipment or any sort of hardware to run your backup solutions. It's actually just there to start using as part of the Azure services themselves. And as I just touched on, there are clearly cost benefits to doing this. Predominantly, the main one is you only use for the service that is used. What does that mean? You're not charged when you write your backups to the Azure service. That's called Ingress. So moving data into the Azure platform, into the Azure cloud offering, you don't occur in charges. You're literally only charged for the storage that you're using, and I'll touch on that a little bit further on in this video. One of the technical benefits for using Blob storage, if you have, for example, a VM or an IaaS VM, there's a limit to how many disks you can present and mount to your VM. Obviously, using a URL to access Blob storage, be it page or block, there's no actual limit there. It's literally just a URL notation to access your backup area, and again we'll touch on that in the video shortly. So very quick comparison of the storage tiers. So again, this is all in the context of block. So the three tierings that we're going to be talking about here are hot, cool, and archive. And so basically, as you can see, your hot storage, you have, as you'd expect, availability is quite high at 3 nines there, depending which actual storage type you choose. It goes through to 4 nines. As you can see, we're using RAGRS there. In my demonstration, which I'll also cover off, I'm just going to be using LRS storage, so that's 99.9 available. And as you can also see, the latency is very low. It should be milliseconds. Drop through to cool storage tiering. Again, the availability drops slightly. But the latency to access that is still in the milliseconds. And then, as you can see, the archive storage tier, which is one of the features, one of the main features for this video, is there is no availability by its very nature. It's an archive long-term cold storage option. So you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want to pay for that sort of service to be available, readily available. That's not the nature of what the service is offering you. It's offering you long-term secure storage, and as you can see, as a result of that, the latency drops off significantly. So, as with a physical tape offsite system, it's the same with your Azure Blob storage. Your storage backups are available, but you just have to wait for those backups to be rehydrated up to the cool storage tier. And as you can see there, that can take anything up to 15 hours, which usually tends to be faster than, as I've just mentioned, traditional offsite tape systems. Very quickly, we'll touch on the storage options. So this is in the context of the pricing, which is the main driver why you should really be wanting to look at the archive storage option for Blob backups. So in the context here, basically, as you can see, I've selected, this is the public, this is a screenshot of the public calculator. So I've picked up on LRS for Western Europe, and these figures are shown in pounds sterling. To give you an idea, again, here's the three tiers. You've got hot, cool, and archive. The main thing to draw to your attention is the price differential between the hot and the archive. As you can see here, the archive storage is considerably cheaper to run. So that said, I'm going to jump over to my Azure subscription and we'll quickly run through what we've got here. So as I mentioned, my actual SQL code we'll be touching on in a minute is running off an Azure IaaS VM. It doesn't have to be that in particular. That's just the access to the Azure instance, to the SQL Server instances that I have on my Azure subscription. So this could equally be an on-premise physical box or an on-premise virtualized machine, or it could also, in theory, be an actual SQL Server DB PaaS service. So this is an Azure IaaS VM, and I have two Blob accounts, service accounts, storage accounts here. So I have a hot one and I have an archive one. If I just click through to these so you can see, I'll show you basically the setup I have. So we're currently on the hot one. So this is standard LRS Blob storage. I want to draw your attention here in particular to the actual storage account itself. So as you remember from the previous slide, there are three storage accounts. So the first one is the GP version 1 storage account, so general purpose version 1 storage account, and that's our oldest type of storage account offering, and that's used for basically where you're using the classic deployment model. So customers who were early adopters of Azure may well be on GP v1 storage accounts. The Blob feature itself is only available via the other two storage accounts, and they are the general purpose v2 account or the Blob storage account. You can only get Blob storage via those two accounts, so GPv2 or the Blob storage account. So in particular, the point I'm making here, if you look at my accounts, I'm actually using the Blob storage in particular. So just quickly show you those accounts, so basically on here I have, browsing my blobs now, I have one container called SQL Backup and that's empty. So we're going to cut a backup into that, and this is our hot one. So this is the storage account that you'd have attached if you wanted to take backups during the day. So for DBAs watching this video, if you're cutting backups to, we sometimes call them online disks, hot disks, or local disks. So even though they may well be SAN attached if you're on an on-premise or a virtualized environment, or they could actually also be local disks. The idea of this is, so even though this is Azure Blob storage, I'm using the hot tiering offer service tiering to basically mimic or represent that you can use Azure Blob storage in favor of using more costly SAN or local attached disks. And I'll then, just to move on to put this all into context, I then have a second storage account where we're going to be showing the idea of archiving, so the archive tier. And again, just quickly talk through it. Again, I've got a SQL backup container that's currently empty, so we'll cut a backup to that shortly as part of the demonstration. Just actually show you the properties of that. So once again, this is an LRS storage, and it's a Blob storage account. So let's actually, and just so I can explain that. So standard performance on the cool access tier for our Blob archive demonstration, and I'll just jump back to, I didn't actually show you this point, so if I just jump back to our hot one, again standard performance, but the access tier is hot by default. And again, what I can show you here, as you can see, here's the LRS, locally redundant storage option that I've taken, and that's the same for also the archive option. So I just jump in here, configuration, and again, as you can see, I've taken the locally redundant storage option on the cool tier. So let's actually get on with some backups. So this is just the standard SSMS tool. I've connected to, as you saw, basically an Azure IaaS VM. That's the SQL Server version I'm running. I have one database here. It's a demonstration database. This takes a second to load up, just to give you an idea of the kind of sizing we've got here. And while these backups are running, they take a minute or two to run. I would actually pause the video so you're just not staring at a blank screen. I'm showing this to give you an idea of the database there. So we've got, it's not a huge database, but it's also not one that's just in the few megs or K. So basically what we've got is approximately to a 911 gigabyte database here. So all the data in here is just test data. It's not Microsoft or customer data. It's just some dummy sample data that I'm going to be using. So the way you access your Blob storage, as you'll be familiar if you're already using page Blob backups via your, for example, your general purpose V2 account, you need a credential. SQL Server credentials is quite a common way that we now use to access external resources. So for example, if you use Polybase as a Polybase video, you'll also find in this YouTube channel, again, you'll see there where we create a credential. You need a credential here for your SQL Server instance to be able to talk to your Blob storage. And the particular type I'm going to be using is this shared access signature. So again, to keep that in context, I'll just show you how you create that. So let's drop through to our hot Blob storage account, and then you can see here we've got an option to share access signature, basically how to create one. So I'll just load that up. Here it comes now. And this is where you set your parameters to generate the access key to allow you to access that Blob storage account. So jumping back through to SQL. Here we go. So that is the key that's generated. Again, these keys are all time and date dependent. So that I've set that one to expire. I think it's some point the next few days. The important point being here, for the credential, the way I've set this one up, this is actually pointing to effectively my URL. So I'm creating a credential, and the name I've given here. So when you're in a larger environment and you're going to have a lot of different URLs, I've actually created my credential to represent where the backups are being taken. So as you can see here, in this case, we're backing up to the blob hot. Remember, that's the storage account we just looked at earlier. And in particular, there's the SQL backup container, which is currently empty, as I showed you. We created the shared access signature, and here is that shared access key. I've already created that, so I won't run that now, but just to show you what we're then doing. So we're then going to back up our database. So we're going to back up the database SQL demo, which is the approximately 11 gig database that I've just shown you. And again, there's an sp help command here, one of the old commands to get a quick summary idea of your database. So I've run that here, and as you can see, we've got just over 9 gigs worth of data. So I'm going to set this back up running. So we are backing the SQL demo database to the URL, which is the notation we use to direct to our blob storage, and as per the credential I've created up here, but the first one I'm going to do a straight backup to the hot blob, so blob hot, into the SQL backup container, and the backup is actually going to be called SQL demo.back. So I'm going to set that running. I'll show you when we come back to this. The clock takes, I think it takes about a minute and 14 seconds, but rather than you having to watch that, I'm actually going to pause this video and I'll cut back in once the backup's finished running. So let me set that off. There it goes, and I'll talk to you in a short while. Okay, so the backup's completed there, as you can see by the standard message you get when we run a backup within SQL Server, and as you can see down at the bottom here, it took 1 minute 26 to run, just to show you that that backup has been cut. I'll jump through to my subscription. So the blob hot storage account, we'll browse the blob. Here's our SQL backup container, and there's our actual standard backup file. So again, the point here being, you can see the access tier is hot, so this is our hot one, and it's a blob, basically 9 gigabytes. And the one thing I want to show you is if we then select the blob properties, we get this idea of, we can looking at the properties of the actual backup file. Is you can then see here that we have access to this access tier. So the blob we've just written to is the hot one, just trying to make that point obvious. And as it says, it's hot inferred. But as you can see, we then have the option to switch that individual backup file between the tiering. So you can drop that down to the cool tiering, where you can start to save money. And more importantly, you could then drop that backup file down to the archive tier, when this tier is only available, as I said at the start, via this blob account, storage account, or the GP general purpose version 2 storage account. So, and that is how you would then switch to this archive tiering. But I'm going to jump back out now to put this into a slightly different context. So you're not going to want to write all of your backups and then move it between the 3 tiering. So there's another way you can use this. So jumping back into SQL Server, again, what you can see here, I've got the same database. I'm going to back it up to a blob URL. In this case, I'm backing it up to the blob, the archive storage account, which, if you remember, is the one that is set on the cool tier by default. And again, I'm also going to call that SQL backup. I'm going to set this one running, and then similarly, when you're writing to blob storage, depending upon either your database file, basically the size of your database and obviously the resulting size of your backup file, or for performance reasons, what we recommend when you write to blob storage is you use striping. And this striping is exactly the same context as backup striping we've had for a good while inside SQL Server. So basically you stripe your backup, and in this case you can see I'm striping over 4 files: SQL Demo A, SQL Demo B, SQL Demo C, and SQL Demo D. So I'm doing that so I can address a larger amount of block blob storage, and also it becomes more performant as you stripe. Effectively, you're writing your backup in parallel rather than to a single file. So I'm going to set both of these commands running, and then I'll jump through to, as you saw earlier, this archive blob archive storage account is currently empty, so I'll set both of these running, and then I'll drop through to show you the backups, and then we'll talk around the idea of switching between the tierings and how you can contextually use that in an operational environment. So I'll set them both going, I'll pause the video again, and then come back when they've both completed. There it goes. Again, I'll talk to you in a short while. Okay, so that those two backups have respectively taken, again, as you can see here by our standard confirmation message. So I will jump through to the actual blob storage. So here we go, blob archive, where we've just written those two backup files, browse blobs. There's our backup container. Go into the backup container, and here you can see our files. So we have the SQL demo back here. And then we have the same one where we're using striping, so demo A, B, C, and D, and they're the four files which make up our striped backup. Again, as you can see here, the access tier this time, because it's our archive one, is cool. It's block blob, and as you can see, so as a single file, that's the size of it, and then it's apportioned out over the number of files if you're using striping, as you can see here. And again, the point I want to show is down at the actual blob level. If you select the blob properties, we have access to the storage tiering. So given we're on our archive one here, which I've actually configured as a cool tier, hence the inferred, as you can see, we can then lift that to hot, or we can drop it to archive. And the reason I'm showing you this is you've got a degree of flexibility here, and also it depends upon your cost implications and the size of your estate. So if you're going to start using the block blob feature, what you could do, for example, what some of our customers are doing is they're writing their backups by default to the hot tier. And then, which is effectively mimicking their, if you're on an on-premise or a virtualized machine, that's effectively mimicking the local disks, whether they're attached via SCSI or whether they're attached via SAN. And you're then programmatically dropping those via, when I say programmatically, I mean PowerShell, through to the cool tier, where they are still immediately accessible, but obviously there's more of a degree of delay in terms of the latency, but you're saving money in terms of the storage costs. And then once your backup has then reached a certain aging, so to put this into context, so you could use the hot tier. It's quite common in large estates to have hot or online backups available for say, for example, 3 backups, a 3-day window. You could keep those on the block blob hot tier. Day 3 or 4 onwards, or depending what your local practices and procedures are, you would then drop that down to the cool tier to save some money. Frequently that tends to be on a month, 28-day cycle, so that would sit there for that period of time. And then when you get into the subsequent month, when effectively you then employ some sort of off-site tape backup principle, that's when you could then programmatically, i.e. PowerShell, drop those individual blobs, those individual backup files, down to the archive tiering, i.e. where you put them effectively into cold storage, and that's where you make significant savings in terms of the cost. So that is rough. That's basically our demo today. I have some URLs for you here and to show you what these are. So basically URLs, so quick talk about the blob tiering itself, got a URL there, another one around the difference between the storage accounts, then here's the link for the pricing, and then I've also included, keep this contextually relevant, because during this video you'll notice I'll have mentioned off-site tape systems and associated hardware and costs, and I've also mentioned on-premise or virtualized machines, on-premise virtualized, that is, i.e. Hyper-V or VMware. So again, I've also included Azure Backup as a function and cost comparative example. So those URLs all translate to these URLs here. So this is our URL for a very quick explanation of, as it says here, SQL Server Backup Restore with Blob. So this is an introduction as to why you would use the Blob storage for your backups rather than whatever your current mechanism or principles are. And again, there's some of the benefits that I've actually included in the PowerPoint. This URL here, this is where we talk about the difference between the hot, cool, and archive storage tiers. I will jump back to the URL page in a second to give you another chance to note them down, but that's a good description of the actual tiering. That leads you then obviously into, as I've touched on here, the difference between the Azure storage accounts, and here they are here. So we've got the general purpose V2, general purpose V1, and then the the Blob storage account, which, as I mentioned, it's only the GP general purpose version 2 and the Blob storage, which actually gives you access to this Blob feature, and more importantly, the archive storage tiering underneath that. And then finally, here's the publicly available pricing calculator, and I've just selected Blob there. And then the prices, which are in the PowerPoint presentation that we're using. This shows you, explains the difference between the actual tiers, and there they are there. So general purpose V2 and the Blob storage one, to keep that into context. And finally, back to the URL page, there's the URLs again, so in the same order that I've just ran through them. Anyhow, so that's it, that's the video done. I hope that makes sense to you. I hope it finds it useful to you to manage within your SQL Server estate the efficiency and also the cost, the OPEX of running backups, and why you'd want to start using blob storage, so in particular block blobs versus page blobs. My name is Neil Millington. If you have any questions, then please contact me, as you can see here, on Twitter at Neil Millington. Always happy to help. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you'll find some of the other videos available via the YouTube As Tech channel useful also. That's all for now. Bye-bye. Thanks for your time.